Welcome to this month's policy dialogue called Rethinking Industrial Policy. My name is Zukiswa Kimani. I am the Chief Director responsible for industrial policy within the dtic. Today, it's a very important industrial policy topic that is very relevant for the work that the department is doing and the work that government is doing at large. It is relevant because we have witnessed a number of developments globally, where the world, you can say, it has become very turbulent. So industrial policy would have to be implemented or designed in an environment that is very, very turbulent. We've seen with an advent of COVID-19, we are seeing geopolitical tensions. We are seeing the climate change crisis, the need to build supply chains and resilient supply chains for economic and national security purposes that have placed industrial policy at the center of economic development. Some would say we are seeing a resurgence of industrial policy. Some would say, but industrial policy has been there, but it has not been explicitly implemented as it is currently. We are seeing advanced economies today, such as your US, having policies, for example, that are pursued as in the guise to mitigate against the climate change crisis, like, for example, your Inflation Reduction Act. We are seeing the EU as well implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanisms as a way to fight this climate change crisis. And all these developments have a bearing on South Africa, on what we're trying to do, given the triple challenge that South Africa is facing of high unemployment. Our economy is not growing at the rate that it should be growing for it to be able to absorb the high rate of unemployment. What we're also seeing is levels of inequality that are increasing. We're also seeing poverty not being reduced to the levels that it should, so that the masses of the South African economy can live above the poverty level. We can also make a dent on the high unemployment. So today's discussion is meant to spark a debate on what is it that we need to do differently to change the status quo in the South African economy. How do we change the structure of the South African economy so that we can address this high rate of unemployment that the economy is facing? So for us, I think as a DTIC, we want to hear what is it that we need to do. We want to take what direction that we need to take as government to be able to address some of the challenges that I had alluded to. Today we have 4 speakers from TIPS that will be taking us through a series of papers and topics that they have done, highlighting a few issues and highlighting, also providing recommendations and suggestions on what on the direction that we should be taking on the various topics. We would appreciate your engagement. We would appreciate your insights as well on these topics. We have about 70 minutes for the discussions. We have Dr. Neva Makgetla, who's going to take us through the overview and synthesis of papers and beneficiation and of industrial policy. We have Nokwanda Maseko, who's going to take us through localization for industrialization, talking through options and risks that government should be looking at. We have Lucas Mtembu, who's going to provide us with insights on the paper that is done on the overview of the National Industrial Policy Framework and associated industrial policy action plans that the DTIC was in charge of implementing. We also have Mohammed Patel, who's going to provide us with insights on green industrialization and the implications for South Africa. I'm not sure whether Dr. Makgetla, you are the first one on to take us through your papers. Over to you, Neva.
Thank you, Zukiswa, for the introduction. Okay, so I'm just trying to explain kind of why we're doing this project on rethinking industrial policy. Yeah, so, I mean, I think the argument is, as Lucas will talk about, we started formally doing industrial policy around 15 years ago with the National Industrial Policy Framework, followed by annual IPAPs for the decade of the 2010s, basically. And a lot of things have changed. So internationally, we're finding that it's harder. You know, the assumption was, I think, strongly then that the way to industrialize like Asia was to get into manufactured exports to the global north. But what we have now is that those value chains have actually matured in the sense that pretty much everything that can move out of the global north has been moved. So when we end up competing, we're not competing with relatively well-paid workers in places like the US and Europe. We're competing with workers who, like in China, who earn basically the exact same as our workers. I mean, when you do the comparison, it's pretty much the same salary. So that obviously makes it much harder for us, particularly because those Asian economies, they have the relationships have now been established and infrastructure has been established to make it much easier for them to supply the global north. But also in the global north, we're seeing, as we all know, new kinds of pushback against that model that said the global north would just buy everything from the global south in the way of goods and make up the difference in terms of high-tech exports of goods and services. And especially, so you've seen the new protectionism, obviously, particularly in the US, but also you've seen fiscal challenges in the global north, which leads them to be also more restrictive on a whole range of areas. And, you know, in the case of Trump, genuinely seems to think that tariffs will raise money for him, which is a bit peculiar. And at the same time, the focus on manufacturing, I would argue, has become like the statistical definition of manufacturing is effectively changed. That manufacturing used to include a range of services that have been externalized. So if we only focus on manufacturing the way it appears in the statistics, it's a shrinking share of the economy everywhere in the world, even in China. And part of that is because things like marketing and design and legal services and logistics, all of these things that used to be carried out by manufacturing companies are not carried out outside of the company. So it's quite hard to say, you know, if we target growth in manufacturing production, we may be missing out on how we think about those multipliers and how we manage them and how we particularly get job creation as well as more efficient and effective manufacturing. And I do think it's a problem to say we have to drive only manufacturing when the share of manufacturing in virtually every economy has fallen in the last 10 years. And I think where all of this really shows up, if you look, is that trade and manufacturers globally has been flat for the past 10 years, essentially. I mean, there was obviously a bump under COVID, but it's since come back down. And again, that's not because demand has changed, but because those global value chains, so what was driving the rapid growth in trade wasn't increased demand, it was a shift in production from the US and Europe to other countries. And once that's, you know, once it's now, we're just trading locations within the global south, you're not going to see that rapid growth in manufactured exports. On the domestic side, I think the issue is more that what hasn't changed, because if the aim of industrial policy was to increase the share of manufacturing, move up the value chain, and also create more opportunities for the majority, I have to say we've not been super successful in either area. So if we talk about structural change is hard and slow, but we don't really see much of it. So joblessness is still very high. We still have an employment ratio that is the share of working age adults with employment is still around 40%. The international norm is around 60%. So we have basically 20% of the population that in other countries would be employed here is not employed. No? And what that's very much closely linked to is the destruction of African-owned, particularly African, but Black-owned generally small business under apartheid, including farming, obviously. So that where you see the really big gap is that we have very low levels of self-employment and employers. Around 5% of the adult population has their own business, whether it's a farm or urban. In other countries, in other upper middle income countries outside of China, it's closer to 17%. In China, it's over 20%. So that's obviously, it doesn't mean you can simply replicate small business, but it does help explain why we have these extraordinarily high levels of joblessness. And then finally, we're very, very dependent on mining exports. So the bulk of our exports, over half of our exports still come from the mining value chain. That's much higher than other upper middle income countries. And it's one of the reasons our growth has been, firstly tends to follow international markets, but secondly has tended to be slow compared to other upper middle income countries because commodity prices were depressed for most of the 2010s. And you can see the impact on our growth there. We did undertake major investments in infrastructure in the 2010s. As we all know, it didn't quite work out the way we hoped. So we put billions, particularly into electricity and rail, and in the 2020s, they nonetheless crashed. For reasons that had a lot to do with how we undertake infrastructure and how we think about it. It wasn't just corruption. It's more, there was, I would argue, a cascade of problems that facilitated corruption, but were not also entirely caused by it, although there's a chicken and egg argument there. But we also have this severe fiscal pressure since the COVID downturn, because like everybody else, we did the right thing during COVID. We tried to support lower income families, but that did leave us with a bigger fiscal hole. So here we are trying to do industrial policy with actually declining resources over time in real terms, to a large extent. And then finally, the region, there's a much bigger gap between South Africa's GDP per person and its neighbors than the other BRICS. So if we say the BRICS are the original BRICS were regional powers, most of them, they're like 50% to twice as high in terms of their GDP per person as neighboring countries. With us, it's 3 or 4 times as high. And what that means is we have less of a market, but also less synergy in terms of partners to improve infrastructure, and both within the region and to the global north, if we wanted to use that model of manufacturing growth. So we would argue we need to really think through what is an industrial policy that would apply in South Africa, given that we have these unique features and the international context is changing from what it was, in the 50s and 60s, which is when people think about, the heyday, and in China in the 2010s, the 2000s and 2010s, when they really drove industrialization in those economies. Okay, so then the question would be, for me at least, that if the biggest threat to South African economic growth in many ways is these profound inequalities and exclusionary systems that make it very difficult to maintain stable policies and focus on growing the economy, because the majority don't share in that growth. And that causes, just at a political, economic, also at a technical level, it causes many of the problems we've seen in terms of getting growth going. So if we say, suppose we take the industrial policy, which in Asia, which we don't really say so that much, but it's true, we're really trying to copy. Most of the population were small-scale farmers and other kinds of small business people. So you could focus on raising productivity and not worry too much about people not having jobs. Whereas because of apartheid, what we have here is those same people don't have work at all. So they don't have any earned income. And so the risk is that if we just focus on raising productivity, that we're not, by definition, unless you can very rapidly expand your sales, raising productivity will slow down employment growth. Yeah? So the issue would be, yes, of course, if we could become like China and really rapidly increase our exports to the global north, then we could focus on raising productivity. But the question is that possible in the current context? And how do we think about that? So one way to think about this is this concept of intensive versus extensive growth, where intensive growth is saying, how do we increase productivity in established industries? And again, it will only expand jobs if you can dramatically expand sales as well. No? Extensive growth is saying, how can we grow by bringing new resources into production? That would include, obviously, labor, but also, in particular in South Africa, labor, but also other resources. And the argument is you can grow even if your level of productivity may not be fully competitive. Ideally, does tend to be associated with lower pay, and that's a problem. No? So I think that's an issue we need to think about. So growth of that kind, where you're bringing people into production who were excluded historically, does require very different kinds of systems from what we've historically done with industrial policy. No? So you see things like in agriculture, to some kinds of crafts, for instance, you have like contracting out and other systems where you provide holistic support to new businesses. Because one of the things we have compared to other countries is that because small business was destroyed, we don't have the systems in place that would enable small businesses to grow easily. Because all of those systems that would support small business were basically eliminated to a large extent under apartheid. So you need that kind of holistic support, whether it's a contracting out system or a franchising system or any of those kinds of things. Also, we have the kind of thing that the presidency is working on where you say, how do we provide basic goods and services for communities that they may not be able to pay for precisely because we have these exclusionary systems? So then how would you provide them using state subsidies? And then finally, you can talk about vastly scaling up support for major labor-intensive industries. Like if you look at our exports of things like clothing and electronics, which is what creates the jobs, and obviously plastics and those things, that light industry that creates the jobs in Asia, we actually have a lower share of our exports from those things than almost any other upper middle income country. Yeah? So the question is, can we scale those up? Where would we sell them if we do? And part of the issue is, can we reach meaningful scale in these projects? If we can't, honestly, the alternative is to continue redistribution through the state. And I would argue that would mean really we need to look seriously at a basic income grant and how that would function. And every economist I know says, oh no, then there's even less money for economic growth. And that is a trade-off. That's a problem. Yeah? So, I also think we need to say flat out, we need a stronger prioritization of an enabling environment for inclusive growth, which means firstly, fixing education, because education is still profoundly unequal, with historically Black schools still having around, twice as many learners per educator as historically white schools for a start. And we don't even really track that adequately. Secondly, obviously, as you all know, reliable and affordable infrastructure, but not just reliable, also what people can afford. And secondly, thinking about things like densification, that we have continued to have these very inefficient cities, and that does add to the cost of employment. You could continue this list, obviously, but I think the issue is more to say, how do we think about that enabling environment as part of industrial policy, rather than saying, we'll focus on supporting a few industries. Meanwhile, the overall context is falling apart. Let's see if I can get this right. So to take the example of beneficiation, sorry, I'm now getting up to 17 minutes. I apologize. Most of the job creation is in downstream manufacturing, not the refineries. We hear so much about ArcelorMittal. They actually employ a whole 1,400 people at Newcastle. Yeah? Well, we have millions unemployed and millions who are employed as well. No, so there's like 300,000 in downstream. There's like 10 or 20,000 in upstream refineries. It's also the production of inputs, which we rarely look at. Like we do have very strong production of a whole range of capital equipment for mining in particular, also supports the construction industry, and then services to support both of these phases of production. But these things, downstream in particular, is only competitive if they get the rents. As long as we let the mining companies charge international prices domestically, we have no comparative advantage despite our mineral resources. So we really need to be thinking through, if we're serious about supporting employment creation and also moving up the value chain, how do we think about rents? And there is the issue of coal dependency, as I'm sure Mohammed will talk about, because it's getting in the way of exports already. Yeah? But the problem is anytime you try and touch these things, you run into very heavy lobbying by the refineries and the mining companies. And we found
Sorry,
it very...
Neva, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. I'm all done. I would just ask you all some questions. One is, how do we think of, is the DTIC's mandate to support reconstruction of the economy to make it more inclusive, or is it to support established business? I mean, you have to do both, but what should be the balance at the DTIC? How do we think about that? And I think, like I said, because if you're serious about reconstruction, I think need to consider really different kinds of instruments and projects than if you're just supporting established industry to expand manufactured exports in particular. How do we think of established business in reconstruction? You can't just say to them, out of the goodness of your heart, empower many more people. So what is their role in economic development? How do we think about that? Because we clearly need them. But if we only support them, we're never going to get to a more inclusive economy. And then finally, how do we come up with a clear industrial policy that we can implement consistently, given that we're in a very divided society, where you've got economic power is highly concentrated in a few businesses, but democratic power is spread amongst everybody, theoretically more or less equally. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Neva. I think, can I open it up for questions for about 10 minutes whilst people have maybe questions? Can I get, before we go to the next presentation, are there any questions? There is Freddie. Can you mute Freddie? Unmute, sorry.
Thank you, Zukiswa. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
We
Go ahead,
really-
Freddie. And please keep your questions short, not preambles, please, so that we can give others an opportunity to ask questions as well.
Okay, no worries. But I think in the presentation, there's reference to mining being extraordinarily, our reliance on mining being extraordinarily high. And I mean, is that a problem? We are a mining country, but there's also a reference around downstream manufacturing in terms of creating jobs. So should we have a focused approach towards downstream manufacturing in mining, which we are heavily invested in, or should we continue on this path of trying to manufacture everything and anything in downstream, given that we're not competitive against China?
Elvis, you are next.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Elvis. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Neva, for that short but insightful presentation. One quick question. I do like the fact that you are bringing in some of the intensive manufacturing process discussions, but also trying to also balance it with some of the extensive margins discussions. My question is, in economic theory, there is a fundamental procedure that for you to reconstruct and redistribute, your intensive margins need to grow a lot more than extensive margins in a way that you can further redistribute, because you need some of these outcomes to be generated from the old industries. How do we use industrial policy specifically to do that, knowing that we want to move into new areas, whilst we do know the old industries are also quite important?
Thanks, Elvis. Tanya, you can please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Neva, for the presentation. You pointed to the need to use new industrial policy tools. I just wanted to check, because there are a number of tools that are there that are working, but that at this point seem to serve or reinforce the existing economic structure. So if, for example, we had to look at industrial financing, a large portion of the industrial financing goes into metals, the existing large companies. Given how the state works, how possible is it to rejig these tools so that they can meet new needs? Thanks.
Thanks, Tanya. I'll take the last question from Justin.
Great, thanks. On board with most of Neva's diagnosis. I suppose what I'd like Neva to try and do is maybe give a bit more of a provocation towards the DTIC specifically as to some of the priorities for how they might reorientate their approach. Also bearing in mind what you said, that it's not just the DTIC's issue about industries, it is a whole systems approach, but still, it would be good for you to give that provocation. Thank you.
Neva, you can go ahead.
Okay, there's somebody here in the room. Can they?
Hi, I'm Jezri. I'm a junior researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. I'll try to keep the questions short.
Do keep them short because I went over. So,
Now, the first question is, what's the limitation to just doing import substitution for textiles and garment manufacturing? Surely we don't need those economies of scale. I know there's limitations within World Trade Organization stuff, but is it feasible economically? The second question is to talk about how to interact in the face of strong lobbying. And to ask about the relevance of maybe an orthodox class analysis approach. You know, is there a way that one can mobilize popular classes? Because very often there's this reliance on the idea of a national bourgeoisie that patriotically invests in the country or is so invested in the country that they need industrial policy. Very often that's not there. There are ways in which other classes, when they organize, can act to create a state which is disciplined enough that will discipline industry. And there's also the issue that most traditional industrial policy has happened around heavily militarized states, whether that's a US client state like South Korea or a quote unquote anti-imperialist state like NASA.
it's depressing. Sorry.
But how do we build in that absence a viable coalition that doesn't involve those pressures on the state to rapidly industrialize?
Cool.
Yeah.
Neva, maybe tackle those questions because there are still, I've got a few more questions.
Maybe we should wait till after the presentations then, because otherwise we won't be able to talk about the other presentations.
Okay.
You think? Okay, so I will try and answer this quickly because I think we'll have a longer discussion later. I do think, you know, the really big question that comes out of all of this is we clearly need a balance. And this has always been the trouble with South Africa, that because we had a peaceful transition, we're busy trying to sort of change the economy while keeping it running. So it's like everybody always says, trying to fix your car while you're driving it. You know, we are trying to retool our car into an EV, self-driving vehicle while we are driving it. And that's very hard and slow. I would argue in terms of the Coalition for Change, that's the thing, is the social pact was the Povo remain patient and they will get jobs and so on down the road, and they haven't gotten them. And now what you see is people turning to populist solutions because as technocrats, we haven't delivered. So I would argue the one bottom line is if you want to build a broad coalition to support industrial policy has to support core constituencies in the economy. As long as the ruling party could take those constituencies for granted, I think that power wasn't as strong. But over time, you know, people do get impatient and they've been told how long do you have to wait before you start getting those benefits. And then, you know, so I would argue this is one reason industrial policy has to change, is if we don't start delivering to the voters, doesn't matter if we're delivering to manufacturing to some extent or not. Yeah? I think in terms of the more straight economics questions, it is also, again, we need to maintain established business. We need to help it grow. I would argue that maybe we should focus more on saying, you know, use heavy industry as a source of resources. And by the way, the thing about mining dependency, most people would agree it is a problem because you're not getting a lot of value add from your minerals. But also it doesn't create a lot of direct jobs. You know, even the whole value chain, even with the downstream machinery and equipment, which is quite big, you know, you're looking at something, it generates well over half of our exports, but it generates around 500,000 jobs, which is what, around 5% more or less of total employment. Yeah. So I would argue we should think about it as the benefits are exports, there'll probably never be employment in a big way. How do we capture those resources and use them to grow more employment creating operations? And I do think, you know, and that's kind of what Tanya was saying about heavy industry, that a lot of our industrial policy has effectively supported heavy industry that cannot create jobs because that's the established businesses that have the capacity to grow in many ways. And I think these are hard choices. You know, like we always say, if it was easy, we would have done it. But I think we should at least be aware of those choices and say we need a balance. How do we think about that balance in a way that will, in the at least a realistic time frame, create more opportunities for the majority of South Africans? So
Please
I would
find
argue
what
what that also means in terms of industrial policy is we should really focus more on getting the basics right for established business and focus where we want to bring about change on light industry and other kinds of schemes that will create employment, including in the services, including, like I said, extensive as well as intensive growth and so on a much larger scale. The one thing I would say about can you redistribute without extensive growth? That's the point. If you have extensive growth, you will have more equitable earned income, so you don't need to have redistribution through the state. That is, the secondary redistribution through the state doesn't have to be as strong, hopefully, because people are having their own incomes, which I would argue is empowering and builds social cohesion in a way that simple redistribution doesn't. Which is why, for me, redistribution is second best, even though it's necessary. But the point is, if we cannot increase people's earned incomes, then of course we have to redistribute, particularly if we want to remain a democracy. And I think that that's a part of the hard choices that we face. And how we, again, those of you who do policies, Zukiswa, you know this, it's always about the balance. It's never about one or the other in practice. So all of this is about saying, can we shift the priorities rather than saying, can we simply get rid of something? No? Thanks.
All right, thank you. We will try. Neva will respond to some of the questions that were posed on the chat box through the Q&A session. Can we now move on to the next presentation from Nokwanda Maseko, who is a senior economist at TIPS, who's going to take us through a paper, Localization for Industrialization, Implementation, Options and Risks. Over to you, Nokwanda.
Okay, so our favorite topic, localization. So this paper is not necessarily a look into, trying to figure out new ways for localization, but it's more of a review of what's already there, what's existing already, and where I think there could be fixes. And so by way of introduction, I think I would like to make it clear that I do not believe that as a country we fully realize the benefits of localization. And when you look at part of the reason for this is one of the biggest is that there's sort of no agreement really on the economic logic of localization. There's arguments around, is it actually cost effective for the state to continue supporting localization initiatives? But aside from that, there is quite a lot of fragmentation, and we have this conversation quite a lot around fragmentation of, state procurement, and that essentially means that each government institution figures out its own procurement, and therefore it's never consolidated properly. And then the last point is around the influx of cheap imports that have been coming into the country, especially around clothing and textiles, but other industries in which, South Africa did have some sort of capability. And so the aim really of this analysis is to look at, what's happening with localization in the country, and does so by sort of looking at the import intensity of major industries, looking at existing policies, as well as the resourcing mechanism around some of that. And so this slide is looking at, the imports intensity of GDP across various country groups or income groups, rather, and South Africa is the red line. But what we can see clearly is that we're generally not that much of an outlier compared to peer economies. And when you look at it even further, I think in some cases we're doing better than high income countries. But there's obviously a difference in terms of why that is. So high income countries don't necessarily, as Neva was pointing out, they don't necessarily have to be producing some of these things anymore. They've moved their production to lower income countries, middle income income countries, for example. And so what they're importing back into the country is around, whatever they're not manufacturing locally, but also around some of the luxury goods that they would want to procure from elsewhere. And as you can also see, there has obviously been an increase in the import intensity of South Africa's GDP. And again, as Neva was pointing out, part of the issue here is that this is reinforced by high dependence on mining particularly. But obviously, we have seen a growth in South Africa's imports over the last few years. And so why is it important to look at imports in the context of localization? So the first part is that it can help us identify where there are opportunities for localization. And so essentially then from there, we need to make a decision about when we decide to localize certain things, are we looking at it in terms of the value of those particular imports or the volumes that, we're importing into the country? There are obviously differences. You find that with mining equipment, if we're going to be importing that, those are generally low volume items, right? But they're very high value. And so does it make sense for South Africa to then focus on producing those equipments that are low volumes but high value? And also, are they labor intensive enough to help solving the problem of high unemployment? Those are some of the considerations that we need to be looking at. And also, I think there are lessons to obviously be learned from the automotive industry. We know a lot of state funds have gone into the automotive industry. Are we actually reaping the benefits of that as things stand right now? Also looking at, over the last 5 years, there has been a shift actually in terms of South African automotive exports and imports. We're seeing also the sort of growing competition from Asian countries such as Thailand, such as India, for example, where South Africa is now not necessarily producing the kind of vehicles that we were producing. So even the movement of the Polo to other countries, and we're buying a lot more small cars from India. Like there's a lot of Kwid cars on the road, right? And we're importing those in high volumes. And so what are the implications for South Africa's automotive industry and therefore by extension, South Africa's localization policy and industrialization more broadly? So the table is really just a consolidation of the top 10 imports annually and their share of total imports. And so as you can see from this table, quite a lot of what we have been importing is petroleum. You see it even in the top 100 imports. But for me, what I think is important to note is that in that top 100 accounts for more than half of the value of South Africa's top imports, total imports, excuse me. And part of like a big chunk of those imports are, again, petroleum, but there's also automotives and, related parts. And then the other thing to note is that about half of those top 100 imports are actually intermediate products. And so there is clearly something that is happening in terms of manufacturing in the country that requires those intermediate products. But the other thing is that almost half of the top 100 imports, around 42%, is final goods. So that includes, for example, smartphones that we're seeing there. Might not necessarily, we will not be seeing it in this particular table, but there's also renewable energy materials that we've seen growth in. There is also other, consumer goods that are falling into the top 100. I did not include foreign currency here, obviously, because it would not make sense, but we have been getting quite a lot of foreign currency over the past few years. And so looking at localization policy, I don't think I need to delve deeply into this. I think we all know that in terms of localization policy in this country, there are differences in terms of what the state is doing and what the private sector is doing. State, mostly policy related, right? With the declaration that the 2017 Public Procurement Act was unconstitutional. Now we have the 2024 one. And there is sort of a change in the legal framework that provides guidance, but even that is not necessarily clear. I think the one important change that we've seen from the new act is, we need to make sure that there's at least 3 producers of that particular product in the country. Is it viable? Not sure at the moment. I guess we'll see as the implementation happens. But there's also other guidelines within the new act that I think at some point we are going to then need to clarify through proper regulations, through proper conversations amongst the relevant parties. And then also in support of localization, we have, other measures such as incentives, such as grants, and more the Competition Commission is requiring that companies applying for measures and acquisition focus on making sure that there's not designation per se, but procurement of locally manufactured products. And then from the private sector, this is really around, efforts around proudly South African, and those are not legally binding. And so private companies can decide where they want to procure whatever goods they want to procure. And then also there is the master plans. Obviously, after the IPEPs, now we have the master plans, and I suppose we will see from the commitments that have been made in the master plans whether there's any increase in local procurement and actual local production, not just local procurement from a company that imported those goods, but actually procurement from companies that are producing locally. Okay, so this is the resourcing part. I've cut out, there's a fuller report on the TIPS website, so I've just taken a bit of that report and put it here. And I think what's important to note here is how the institutions of the state support production, support business, and therefore the work of industrialization. And what I would like to point out here is from a point that Neva was making earlier around the decimation of small business, and then go back to how we are supporting small business, SMMEs more broadly. So if you look at the top part that looks at Black supplier development, right? Black business supplier development. It's meant to fast track, development of SMMEs, right? But then in terms of the turnover requirements, that's 250,000 all the way up to 35 million. It's a big chunk, right? And then most of the other funding mechanisms that exist, minimum turnover is 100 million. Right. How many small businesses in the country actually make a turnover more than 1 million? And more importantly, when we require businesses, especially small businesses, to have such a big turnover, when we know that some of the struggles of actually setting up a business are at the beginning, before you even get to making the turnover that you need to make to meet the requirements for the funding, then what does that mean for how we are actually using the support from the state to support these businesses? It's much more easier in terms of access for established businesses than it is for small businesses. And so I think that's one of the things we need to consider in terms of where are we actually putting the funding? What are the requirements that we're putting in place for people to be able to have access to that funding? And is it actually getting in the way? But more importantly, I think the sort of organization or the fragmentation of these different funding mechanisms makes it such that, bigger companies know, okay, we can go to the DTIC, we can lobby, whereas the smaller companies that are struggling to get around the red tape say, hey, do I go to the Department of Small Business or do I go to the DTIC? And they're drowned out through all of the lobbying of the bigger companies. And that's, for me, one of the important things to keep in mind when we think through some of these funding tools that exist at the moment. Okay, and then in terms of some of the proposed policy measures, this is not looking at new proposals. This is not me saying, hey, let's do something different. So what I was doing here is looking at what already exists and how we can try to improve it. And so from a public procurement perspective, one of it is around designation, the other is around, tendering processes. So on the designation part, I think the important thing that we need to look at is creating a framework for selecting designated products. And I know that, there's an argument from the DTIC that there is a framework for selection of these products. But when you look at the products, do they actually make sense? Are they aligned with the requirements of the state such that when they're actually produced and they're procured, they go straight into the different institutions that the state requires them to go into? So infrastructure projects, for example, we have a lot of, I was looking at the numbers, I think it's over R1 trillion in the medium term in terms of infrastructure spending. And that's across different departments, right? So if we can figure out what the requirements from those departments are in terms of infrastructure spending, but even in terms of their sort of low-level spending around, clothing and textiles, for example, is there actually a way to support local businesses using the power of the state, making sure that it's aligned with the designated products that are out there? Because when you look at what's designated right now, and yes, I'm going to go back to the wheelie bins, but the wheelie bins are sort of still a problem for me because why are those designated? You know what I mean? Like, for me, it still does not make sense. But there are other things on there that are designated, and I think, it makes sense in terms of supplying local industry, supplying requirements from the state in terms of infrastructure needs. So cement, for example, that's an industry that's struggling, but also the government has a lot of infrastructure projects that require cement. And also it filters over into the private sector because, we like building things as a country. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to do. And then in terms of the tendering processes, we really do need to get, but, just in terms of procurement and redesigning the tendering system, I think the one point that we've always gone back to is, do we really need government institutions to say, hey, we want Timberland boots? Right? We don't even make those in the country, but there are other boots that we make in the country, that without the very stringent specifications from departments can then be procured locally. There are obviously other things here that are covered, but Zuki, I am going to step down now. As I said, this is a bigger piece that's available on the TIPS website, so people who want to read it can read it from the TIPS website. Thank you.
Thanks, Nokwanda. I'm sorry to rush you. There are still 2 more presentations that we need to go through. We won't open it up for questions. Can people note their questions down so that we start with you, followed by Lucas and Mohammed, and then Neva will come last, given that she has had a chance to have a bite at the questions. Thank you, Nokwanda, for that. Can I call on Lucas to take us through his presentation on the overview of the IPEPs and NIPF? Lucas, I would also ask you to be brief so that we can engage as much as possible. You can go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you, Zuli. So I'll be presenting on the overview of the National Industrial Policy Framework as well as the Industrial Policy Action Plans. So the NIPF aim to support labor-intensive industries and value-adding industries. and it aimed to provide a shift from commodity reliance and promote the inclusion of historically disadvantaged people. And then IPEPs were annual strategies which had key action programs, instruments, as well as outcomes. And there were 9 IPEPs over a 15-year period from 2007 to 2018. Okay, so I conducted a textual analysis of all of the IPEPs, and then these were the most prioritized industries. So most of these appeared either between 7 to 9 times over the period. And then BPS was the only new industry which was prioritized within the IPEP. So I'll go through them looking at the key action programs as well as the outcomes. Okay, so these were the developments in manufacturing. So manufacturing GDP declined from the early 2000s and remained constant from 2011. And as you can see that this decline does not measure up to other upper middle income countries, excluding China. Formal employment also declined during this period. Okay, so within the automotive industry, so the APDP was replaced by the MIDP in 2010 and with the aim to produce 1.2 million vehicles by 2020. And as you can see, the production trend shows that it wasn't in line to produce 1.2 million vehicles by 2010, having produced over 400,000 vehicles in 2020. Okay, so in metal fabrication, capital equipment, and transport, the National Tooling Initiative and the National Foundry Technology Network sought to improve competitiveness and technological capacity to develop skills. The NFTN did not address the import leakage, which is sought to address, and as the industry continued to employ high value-added imports. Okay, so within the agro processing industry, there were trade policy challenges in 2007. And then with local producers competing against heavily subsidized global producers. And then import tariffs were used in order to counter global competition. The aim was to create new sub-industries such as aquaculture and to increase exports. And then within the IPEPs from 2007 to 2018, within the agro-processing industry, there were intermittent key action programs. So they were not constant over time. They kept on changing, as well as the measures which were used to support the industry during the time. And then fruits received the largest share of financial support during this time, which resulted in the export of fruits and nuts rapidly growing. And then also the trade surplus for the industry more than doubled. Okay, so within the clothing, textiles, and footwear and leather industry, the industrialization of the industry was due to global competition. Mainly from Asian imports from China. And at the same time, there was trade liberalization during this time. And that started from the 1980s, where tariffs were about 28%, and then they went to 23%, and then in 2006, as Zuki said yesterday, they went to 8.2%. And then the Clothing and Textiles Competitiveness Program, as well as the production incentive, were introduced in 2010 in order to restructure the industry as well as provide long-term sustainable support. And then the effect of this was it stopped the deep decline in production from 2006 to 2012. And then after that, production remained constant. However, formal employment also declined during the period of IPEP supporting the industry. And CTFL was the industry which declined the most in formal employment during the iterations of IPEP amongst the most prioritized industries. So the pharmaceuticals industry was mainly reliant on imports, with support aiming to increase domestic production and reduce import reliance. So ARV production was designated but did not kick off, mainly due to in part due to inefficiencies in regulations. And then within the plastics industry, it was mainly downstream and labor intensive. A key action program in 2017 sought to increase value addition through beneficiation of plastic products that are used in packaging as well as autos. The chemicals industry had a well-developed upstream industry, which included basic and other chemicals. And the aim during this time was to beneficiate minerals into exports and to produce high-value inputs, as well as increase downstream processing. So within all of these three industries, there was a decline in production, and whereas employment grew, and exports also grew during this time. So within forestry, timber, paper, and pulp and furniture, it prioritized rural development with 161 water licenses issued from 2007 to 2011. Small-scale sawmills received support for skills and technology upgrading to improve production inefficiencies. And the furniture cluster was of small manufacturers was proposed in the Eastern Cape, KZN, and Gauteng in 2010 to meet retail demand. A key furniture key action program sought to develop high-level skills from 2014 because of skills shortages. Employment and production also declined within the industry despite it maintaining a trade surplus. So within green industries, they were prioritized to counter environmental concerns which were growing from global countries. And so the solar water heating program did not take off, in part due to imports and as well as lower quality installations. The renewable energy procurement programs facilitated renewable energy production as it grew. But despite localization efforts by the industry, the local industry still imports most of its inputs. Okay, so in PPS, the main aim for PPS was to create 100,000 jobs, and it was forecasted that it was going to contribute 1 billion to the economy. And then the Munyetla Work Readiness Program was part of was a key action program which was introduced, and it helped assisted 16,000 young people to gain training. And then the industry has not been able to create 100,000 jobs as forecasted. Okay, so some of the key takeaways from analyzing IPEP is that the automotive industry was not able to produce 1.2 million vehicles by 2020 as forecasted. Metal fabrication, capital equipment, and transport could not reduce its import leakage. Agro-processing contributed positively to the balance of payments, and pharma, chemicals, and plastics grew despite a growing trade deficit. And then forestry, timber, paper, and pulp and furniture saw declines in both production as well as employment. And then green industry supported IPP capacity. And then PPS was not able to reach its goal of creating 100,000 jobs. Okay, so in conclusion, so the industries were spread so thin, and for that reason, as Zuki said at our port conference yesterday, there was no real prioritization because there were too many industries which were selected, and there was over 30 industries which were selected throughout the IPEP period. And then at the same time, there was lack of collaboration between the industry as well as government for most industries. And at the same time, as you can see from the automotive industry as well as BPS, the targets were ambitious. And then, and then in 2019, the dtic sought to reimagine the industrial strategy and then introduced master plans as the industrial policy tool. So it realized that the issues with IPEPs were it didn't have platform for engagement between the stakeholders as well as government. And it sought to then prioritize a few industries instead of spreading it too thin. It also seeks to align government across departments as well as its entities. Yeah, thank you. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Lucas, for that overview. per the previous presentation, we will hold on to the questions defer them to the Q&A session. I will now call upon Mohammed Patel, Senior Economist, TIPS, to take us through the green industrialization in South Africa.
Okay, thank you so much, Zukiswa. Thanks, colleagues, for joining us here today. So I'm going to do an input on green industrialization. It's based on a paper called A Policy Primer for Green Industrialization in South Africa that was written by Gelo Mosongclair and myself. Gelo was an ex-colleague, I'm sure well known amongst everyone here. So I'd just like to acknowledge his input into the paper as well. Okay. Cool. So the shocking news is that climate change is still real, despite what we see on the news these days and the rapidly changing policy landscape and sustainability policy landscape in many different regions of the world. There's still scientific consensus that the climate is changing, and that's highly likely due to human industrial activity. So in this context, it's very important for South Africa to keep track of these dynamics, particularly given the emission intensity of our economy, our high reliance on fossil fuels and specifically coal, both for electricity generation, as well as an integral input into the petrochemicals complex around Sasol and the various downstream value chains that the products that emanate from Sasol feed. So coal is an important resource in our economy, but unfortunately, it's not really great from a climate change perspective. And we're in a world that's increasingly moving away from fossil fuels and fossil-intensive production towards more sustainable production. So in this context, it's really important for South Africa to protect its domestic interests, to ensure a just transition, and there's a lot that can be unpacked in what that means, enhance economic and population resilience to climate shocks, and also secure its role in the global community. We are very integrated economically with other countries and trade partners. So not only do we need to be concerned about our domestic policies around sustainability, but we also need to keep track of what's happening in our key trade partners and how that impacts trade between us and our trade partners, as well as the competitiveness of our key exports. So it's a balancing act to maximize the benefits of a transition towards more sustainable production, to minimize the transition risks in that process, and mitigate negative impacts, particularly around some of the key issues that we're concerned about as a country, like employment inequality, and to manage the short-term trade-offs and threats in line with domestic capabilities. So I think I've covered some of this already, but an important point to draw out is inequality in emissions specifically. So even though South Africa is highly carbon intensive per capita, in terms of absolute emissions, we're really dwarfed by some of the other countries that are much larger producers than ourselves. So dominant emitters themselves also bear huge responsibility for climate change. It's a global moral and ethical issue. And just to draw out the fact that the USA, the EU, and China have historically accounted for about 60% of emissions globally, comparing that to 3% for the continent of Africa. So I think that provides some pause for thought in terms of where we sit in this whole process. Our role is still important, and we still have an urgency to decarbonize, but it just draws out the inequality in terms of the emissions spectrum. Also, the richest 1% of humanity is responsible for more GHG emissions in total than the poorest 66%. So that's also showing you, who's paying for whose benefit. These tensions are anticipated to grow moving forward. If this is left unchecked, this inequality will just grow wider and wider. Climate impacts are set to exacerbate poverty in the global south, especially in Africa, if left unchecked. So it becomes even more important to pay attention to what needs to be done domestically and internationally in terms of how we interact with other countries and what their policies are and where they're headed. I think I've covered the inequality element, and so for the purpose of time, I won't spend too much on this. Just to note that there is some recognition of this inequality, and many of us know that there are big programs, donor-funded programs like the dtic process, for example, to try and fast-track decarbonization in South Africa and a whole lot of other countries. I mean, these processes, while on the face of it are laudable, it's mobilizing funding from various countries. There are intricacies within how these processes work, the type of financing, grants versus concessional loans versus market-related loans, the quantum of those funds, etc. And now, I guess, whether some of those funds are going to be available or not by certain countries like the US. It calls all of this into question, but there have been attempts to try and highlight this inequality and to assist South Africa in its decarbonization journey. On the flip side, we also have trade partners engaging on the face of it in policies to prevent carbon leakage. So they have domestic emissions policy for their domestic producers. And now the idea is how can we prevent imported carbon? So we see the rise and institution already of key border carbon penalties, so border carbon adjustments. And we know that the EU CBAM is one that's spoken about a lot. It's already in its administration period, and from 2026 is set to impact a few targeted sectors for now, like iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizer, etc. But there is a risk that this portfolio of impacted goods is going to grow over time, and it places South Africa at increased risk for exports into that region. So, where is South Africa, and how can we think about South Africa in terms of its emissions picture? And what do we know about this? So we know quite a few things. I just mentioned at the beginning, Zukiswa and Neva also mentioned, there's this minerals reliance, and there's been this historic development of the minerals energy complex, which is often referenced to, which was supported by cheap. Back in the apartheid era, relatively cheap coal, and that could really give us cheap electricity to high energy intensive industries. And so industrialization was born on the back of this very intimate connection between minerals and the mining value chain and the energy complex. The result being that our electricity system is still highly carbon intensive, with about roughly 80% of our electricity being produced by coal-based generation. The most notorious of the fossil fuels. It's also an integral part, and we had an event here a little while back looking at Sasol and Secunda. It's also an integral part of the petrochemical complex around Secunda, and is an important input into a number of key downstream value chains, like plastics, like explosives, like fertilizers, etc. So very important, but also very carbon heavy, and poses risks for us moving forward. So there have been some attempts to lower our carbon intensity and to adopt a more sustainable approach. Typically, energy efficiency is regarded as the first port of call in industry. There's been some efforts around this. However, there have been multiple factors that have contributed to energy efficiency drives in the economy. One is direct, programs like, for example, the Section 12 programs by the dtic. However, an important component driving efficiency has just been electricity pricing. So I've included a backup slide. My slides are not going. I'll show it at the end. But it really, so what we did was we plotted the energy available against the average Eskom tariff over time. And what you see is this significant exponential increase in the average tariff over time, which is essentially has forced industries to become more efficient in production, amongst other factors as well. Our emissions are highly concentrated, so Eskom and Sasol overwhelmingly dominate the emissions landscape in South Africa, and this is also followed by some other energy-intensive value chains like steel. From a transport perspective, we also know that there are, particularly issues around the use of rail and moving from road to rail transport. Currently, a lot of transport is carried out via road. If you go to Mpumalanga, you can see for yourself the externalities imposed on the domestic infrastructure by coal transport, for example. So while we have sizable rail capacity, there's an underutilization and a key sort of drive to switch to rail transport, particularly for bulk goods, because of lower comparative carbon emissions as well and lower externalities. So I raised this risk before, why does it matter? Why can't we just sort of isolate ourselves as an economy and say, let's just burn all the coal we have and not care? The problem is, unfortunately, we lived in an integrated community, and this can have very risks for us economically. I mentioned the CBAM. CBAM is a key risk on the horizon. It's going to affect our iron and steel exports. It's going to affect our aluminium exports, our fertilizer exports, and the risk of sectors growing is there. We also see vulnerabilities from this carbon intensity in a number of value chains. I won't go through every value chain. I'll just draw some examples. So, for example, in the coal value chain, it supports over 150,000 people across the value chain. So, we're looking at mining at the Eskom power stations, etc., mining transport. So, when this value chain begins to decline, there then becomes a question as to what happens to employment in this value chain. There's some specific problematic areas. So, for example, if we look at the mining stage, we know just based on the statistics and based on the research work that we've done before, coal miners generally have a matric, but they paid almost double the median wage of the formal economy, which means that if they're displaced, they have a certain wage expectation that's almost double the amount that they can fetch if they try and transition into another job. And then there's also the question is, what kind of job can they transition to for their given sets of skills? So there's some real vulnerabilities that manifest from an employment perspective as well, and there's quite a few value chains that stand to be impacted. I'm going to use Nokwanda's line. These are detailed in the primer, so if colleagues want to look at that further, please have a look at the primer, and if there's any questions, you're more than welcome to email me for clarification. Okay, so given this assessment of the inequality and the risks and the vulnerabilities, where can we go to from here, and what are our options? So South Africa thankfully has initiated a move to lower carbon productions. Lucas mentioned some of the history behind the IPAP. There was over time an increased focus on sustainability in previous versions of the IPAPs. However, specifically focused on renewable energy and energy decarbonization. Although in the past 4 to 5 years, we've really seen an increased focus on decarbonization in other value chains as well, particularly the problematic ones like petrochemicals, like iron and steel, etc. Now we have this shift to the master plan approach, the value chains that are directly impacted by climate change certainly feature prominently sustainability issues in the master plans, but there is room for every master plan to have a kind of sustainability lens and filter and assessment as sustainability issues become increasingly more important in value chains across the country. So then I'll quickly conclude, and we can cover more in the discussion. But some of the important developments have been increases in energy efficiency through Section 12L tax incentive that I mentioned earlier. The penetration of renewable energy. There was the REAP program over time, and I think it was mentioned by some colleagues. There were certain requirements like around local content, for example, where project developers couldn't always meet in terms of regulation, and there were delays along the way. So had those been fast-tracked, we may have seen greater renewable energy penetration. That being said, the REAP was a program to develop renewable energy. Since we've had the exemptions by the president in 2021, there's been a surge in private renewable energy development, particularly for the mines, etc. I've got a backup graph as well, if anyone wants to see, that shows the surge in imports of solar PV panels, etc. since the exemption. So pointing to the increased demand for energy that wasn't being provided to the national utility. sustainability. Carbon taxes and budgets, we know that South Africa's carbon tax has been criticized for being too low to actually deliver change. Increasingly, the carbon tax and what it's set at is becoming an important sort of variable in the economy, because it also has links to other things like border carbon adjustments, how those are calculated and the extent to which South African exports are penalized. So, more focus on this. We're going to have to pay more attention to this and the exemptions as well, to determine where we sit with a carbon price that, delivers, that adequately accounts for the externalities of production and also puts us in a favorable position for some of the risks that we see coming up. So anyway, to conclude, in this paper, we make some suggestions for policy focus and some suggestions for some interventions that can really help. Because the paper is wide and looking at green industrialization as a whole, we cover quite a few angles, strategy, industrial finance, procurement, carbon pricing, standards and certification, trade, energy, transport, waste management, small businesses, just transition, R&D, and some other sectors as well. I can't go through all of them, but please do go through them, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on some of this work. I thank you for your time, and I think we'll explore more in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohammed, for those insights. We will now open it up for discussions. I will start maybe with the questions that were posed on the chat box. Maybe let me start with you, Mohammed. There is a question from Karina Narotam. I think there is a drive to decarbonization, but these need investment. Perhaps our strategies need to be focused on these investment, not just what we need to do, but how and with what funding. That's a question for you. And for Lucas, can you just note them down? For Lucas, are there any policy shifts or updates expected in the next phase of South Africa's industrial strategy? For Nokwanda, how can industrialization and localization policies be leveraged to address unemployment by unlocking the potential of informal SMEs? Another question for you, Nokwanda. How does AfCFTA affect South Africa's localization strategy? Nokwanda, another question for you. How can the South African government balance localization policies with the need for foreign direct investment? Another question from Asanda for you, Nokwanda. Are these localization policies designed to promote competition in respective industries in order to protect consumers from excessive pricing? And then I think there is also a comment or question from Karina to you, Nokwanda. Why have you sourced the import data from ITC Trade Map and not SARS directly? And then she has an opinion on the three producer rule, where she feels, or he feels, it's not viable. It is unnecessarily restrictive and prevents growth of an industry which perhaps only have 2 or 1 producer. Surely those are the industries we need to grow and localize. There is another question to you, Neva. Is it implied that downstream production should be prioritized over upstream production? That was not very clear. I don't fully understand how upstream manufacturing does not create downstream jobs. Downstream jobs also depend on upstream growth, even if it's for exports. Export grows our economy. I believe it's something that we should strive for. And another question to you, Neva. What are the key strengths and weaknesses of South Africa's current industrial landscape? How do these factors influence the need for a new industrial policy? Maybe let me start with the, Mohammed, there's another one. Are there existing successful models from other countries that South Africa could adapt to its unique context in pursuing green industrialization? If so, what are the lessons? What lessons can be learned? And what role can public-private partnerships play in fostering green industries while addressing socio-economic inequalities? Perhaps I will give you maybe 2 minutes each to respond to those questions before we open it up for further questions. I will start with you, Mohammed, followed by Lucas, then Nokwanda, then Neva. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, thank you so much for the interesting questions and engaging with the presentation. So the first question was around, the investments, what kind of investments need to happen, and then there's a sub-component to that: who will fund that or who will pay for that? Is that correct? Is my understanding correct, right? Right. So, naturally, so when we look at sustainable value chains and we look at industries in transition, a lot of the time the answer to that question is value chain specific, right? So in some value chains, there are existing technologies on the frontier that are on the cusp of being proven commercially viable, and just needs that last push. Maybe it's reducing the cost of an electrolyzer, say in the context of green hydrogen, by 50%, so that the economics work out such that the final hydrogen price that's delivered is feasible for sale in a global market. In that case, the investments are initially focused on specific goals for the technology. So you will have a number of different pilot and commercial projects that are seeking to look at different use cases and develop the commercial viability for those cases. So in that case, the investments need to happen there before the large scale investment into a full green hydrogen plant happens, because it hasn't been proven yet. So you need to secure those wins along the way before you get to the full-scale industrial ambition. In other cases, like for example, if you look at the case of carbon capture, the technology is technically possible. You can build a value chain where you trap carbon, you transport it, and you store it. But to do that on a scale that's going to realize the decarbonization that's desired, is simply exorbitant. So while the technology is there and it's feasible, it's way too expensive to realize. And there may be some other challenges in terms of where it's stored, how it's transported, etc. So I think the question of, the investments, where the investments need to happen, largely depend on the value chain in question, the technology in question, and how mature the technology is, or how close we are to it. As to who funds the technology, I think this is an open question. If there's certainly a clear profit motive, then the private sector would jump on this opportunity immediately. In some cases where you don't have an industry and it's at the very early stages and there's a bit of a coordination problem, developers are waiting for the state to send signals. The state is unsure about the investment case. In those cases, you see perhaps a bit of private sector, you see a bit of public sector support. Maybe you have international donors that come on board as well. That's typically how it works. As to who ought to fund the technology, there are concerns around, highly risky technologies and whether tax resources should be spent for that. So there's a whole lot of debate around who pays and in what way and how that can be had. And I think it's quite specific to the issue that's being studied. The second question, if I can just very quickly, is, are there successful models in other countries that can be used? And there was a specific question around the use of public-private partnerships. I mean, they certainly are, and that's our whole job. Well, our entire job as Policy Research Institute is to try and survey the technology, understand policies that have been implemented in other countries, but obviously these have to be tailored to the South African context. So it's never a cookie cutter type approach. Then we certainly can learn from the environment in which certain processes were followed, certain investments were made in other countries, but there may be certain things that are evident in the South African landscape that make them inappropriate. So we just have to be aware of the risks when we assess policies in other countries and that policy context in relation to our policy context and where we stand and what our resources are. Public-private partnerships, sure, to consider them as a model, they certainly can be assessed. Within public-private partnerships, you have different types of models, where responsibilities fall on different parties, etc. Those can certainly be explored. I don't know if they're a magical solution to everything, but they certainly can be part of an assessment.
Thanks, Mohammed. We will come back to. Can we go to Lucas?
Okay, thanks, Zukiswa. So the question about policy shifts, the minister has shown support for master plans as the tool to support industrialization. So I don't think there'll be a shift in it. I don't know, Zukiswa, if you can add further insights into that. Thank you.
Thanks. Nokwanda?
Thanks, Suki. So let's start with the easiest question. Trade map versus SARS. That's the same data. So TradeMap gets their data from SARS, and the reason I use TradeMap is because the SARS database only allows you to select 2 years at a time on a monthly basis. That's over 10,000 lines of code. That's over 10,000 lines of data. So it's easier to use TradeMap, but it's the same data. And then in terms of leveraging localization, I think there's quite a lot of ways to do this, and I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier around infrastructure projects. And I think generally we look at these infrastructure projects as happening outside of sort of the South African economy, as if they're not impacting on South African business. They're not meant to help grow South African business. Right, but there is demand from those projects that can be met through South African production, right? And that also, for me, links to the question around FDI. FDI does not necessarily mean that we can't support localization. So we look at, for example, the amount of money that has come into South Africa to support renewables. There's a big chunk of money that has gone into that, but we are not necessarily producing the sort of products that are required. We're not producing the solar panels. We're not producing the wind turbines. And there has been action to sort of address some of the influx of imports. There was an application to halt, for example, imports of fully assembled panels. And so ITEC put in a tariff on that to say, actually, you can't bring in fully assembled panels into the country. And that application was in part meant to support local production, because there are some companies within SACU especially that are producing some of those panels, and therefore we're not able to compete with the very big portion of imports coming in from China. And so part of the thing we need to realize here is that we are not we have limited power, but we're also not a country without power. The DTIC is not an institution without power. And part of the things we need to think about when we look at some of these projects that are coming into the country, is to actually say, okay, these companies are getting funding from the state. Can we then enforce the requirements that they're supposed to meet in terms of localization? Can we enforce those? Can we enforce the tech requirements from that are included as part of the agreements with whatever companies are coming in to produce, to install whatever infrastructure that needs to be installed? There are businesses in this country, within SACU especially, that are producing some of these things, and we have not necessarily leveraged that production to support localization within the country, but also within SACU, within SADC as well. And in response to the AFCFTA, it's the same answer, but it's slightly more complicated because I think, as Neva was pointing out earlier, we are a continent where there are massive challenges around, infrastructure, but also that power dynamics are skewed, such that there are always questions around, should we include South Africa in this, and how much of the value chain is South Africa going to swallow? Right. And so I think other countries within SADC look at that and say, well, this is going to leave us without power. South Africa is going to take all of the manufacturing and they're going to leave us with nothing. And so I think there needs to be better conversations around, do we actually want to develop alone as a country, which I don't think would work. And so if we won't be able to do that, how do we then leverage what's already existing within SADC to make sure that this partnership across these countries actually grows? It's going to be a very complicated process. I think we have probably better manufacturing in this country than any of the countries that are within SADC. And so I think, again, it's a conversation of power. How do we negotiate these different arrangements going forward? Where do we cede our power? Where do we use our power as well? And then on the issue of competition, I mean, that's a difficult one. Like, yeah, the Competition Commission is now saying to those companies looking to acquire or merge with others, like, hey, you need to actually make sure that you're procuring from local institutions. But part of the thing about, the Competition Commission is that I think part of the things that they've mostly focused on are big business, and no one really is obviously going to compete against Coca-Cola. So the one thing they're going to get from that is, okay, give South African producers or manufacturers, or whoever, just give them the bottling industry, let them bottle for you. And so I think part of then the question that we need to ask is, can we use the Competition Act in industries where things are slightly smaller? The uniforms, for example, yes, we've lost a chunk of clothing and textile manufacturing, but can we actually still go back to that and make sure that, there is local production capacity for some of that, and therefore make sure that there is competition amongst the producers? It's, again, going to be hard. We've lost a lot of manufacturing capacity from clothing and textile industry. And so is there going to be enough manufacturers to actually compete? But those are low-hanging fruit, right? I think part of what then needs to happen is to look at some of the big stuff, the big companies. But obviously that's complicated because those companies, those big ones, are already entrenched into the fabric of the economy. And so then how do you foster competition when you compare that with the smaller guys who have no lobbying power? Sure. Thanks.
Thanks. I think it is central to industrial policy, Zukiswa, correct me if I'm wrong, that we need to move away from commodity dependence. And so part of the issue with beneficiation is how we define commodity dependence. And by the way, we've got a paper on this if you want to see a more detailed argument on our website. That in effect, yes, I think we do need to focus on downstream manufacturing. If we're just looking at refining, the problems that people see with commodity dependence persist. And those problems are specifically that the prices tend to go through cycles, because when the price goes high, people substitute or they find alternatives. So what we saw with platinum was that, platinum boomed with the catalytic converters, and then people found ways to use less platinum per catalytic converter, and that led to a drop in demand again. And then the next thing you know is that they were going to electric vehicles where we may not need them at all. Now, there may be other sources of demand. All I'm saying is there is a core argument in development economics, which is we should try and move away from dependency on commodities, because you rarely get a very, they tend to go through cycles, even if they're super cycles like what we saw in the 2010s, and we get big, and I will say, I always say, this is, yeah, I use better. It's like having an abusive partner. When the prices are high, it's fabulous, which makes it really hard when things are not so good to say, let's move away, because you keep hoping things will get better. And I do think we need to be aware that there are benefits. There are benefits to being dependent on mining. We brought massive riches to this country when the prices were high. The trouble is then they crashed. And so do you focus on the good or the bad? It's, go find a count. Anyways, yeah. And again, I think that doesn't mean and also mining in particular, unlike agriculture commodity dependence, does not create jobs. It creates very few jobs everywhere in the world. So we have under 500,000 jobs in mining itself. And like we said, in refineries, much less, and they're highly capital intensive. And that's the nature of the industry. Metals refineries are invariably highly capital and electricity intensive. Now, in terms of downstream, no, the downstream doesn't need locally produced inputs. It needs cheaper locally produced inputs than we could buy locally. So the comparative advantage for South Africa from mining is if we can ensure that our downstream industries get cheaper inputs. But if those refineries and mines charge export parity prices, then we're not actually getting any benefit from local mining and refining. And that to me is the problem, is that the growth of manufacturing in South Africa was in fact largely based on holding down prices to the mines and refineries for local users before 94, well, before they commercialized and privatized the state-owned companies. So Eskom providing cheap coal-based electricity, ISCOR providing cheap steel, Sasol providing cheap liquid fuels based on coal. All of that was based on holding down the price to the mines for coal and for iron ore. And we kind of stopped doing that in the 80s when we privatized those things. And AMSA in particular, when they didn't buy the coal mine, so they couldn't hold down the price of iron ore. And so I think, that's the thing about the logic. The logic is we use the rents to develop the downstream. Where do those rents come from? They come from the difference between local production costs and international prices. The trouble is, by definition, you're taking the government is being the arbiter about who's going to get those rents. And that's a very uncomfortable position for a government that prefers to try and keep everybody happy, as it were. And so, and from the standpoint, if you're not going to have cheaper prices on domestic products from the mines and refineries, then it may well be that you would do better to import. No, I mean, just because of the much greater value add and technological sophistication and employment in those downstream industries. So if we can't find a way to produce, for instance, steel competitively, does it make sense to say we're effectively going to tax the downstream to keep them in business? Now, what I would say is no, but then why are we not looking at reducing the cost of iron ore and electricity and energy generally for the integrated mills the way we actually did for the mini mills when we held down the price of scrap? Because that is exactly how you move the rents downstream. But if we're not prepared to do that, to simply say we're going to put on a tariff, doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, because you're saving a very small number of jobs in an industry that is relatively electricity intensive and you're at the cost of basically all of downstream industry. No? And I do think a particular problem is that refineries beneficiation, first phase beneficiation of minerals is highly energy intensive. And if it's coal, dependent on coal, and it exports, that can be as we've been saying, that can become a contradiction in the current climate. And I use that both social and actual. I mean, we have had the 10 hottest years in recent history in the last 10 years, just saying, but also because other countries react to that by saying South Africa our energy is extraordinarily coal intensive compared to other upper middle income countries outside of China. And that's a problem in terms of maintaining exports. And I mean, these are realities. I think just trying to pretend they'll go away doesn't actually help us very much. And so, I would say the strengths and weaknesses of South African growth again, in terms of that question, clearly at a structural level, the main problem is we don't generate opportunities for our people at the level you find in other countries, reflected in this very low levels of employment. And I do think that is linked to commodity dependency, specifically mining dependency, as well as the way apartheid disinherited people effectively. But with that, it's not so easy just to say, then can we reconstitute what apartheid destroyed? Because when those businesses were destroyed, you also destroyed the support systems in the sense of, we know about finance, but also things like education, experience, the fact that families don't have assets the way they do in other countries. Other countries, people's families have some land, they have some housing that they can sell, they have some savings. Those things were destroyed in this country. So to say, start a business without assets is kind of extremely hard, but also just access to markets, access to inputs, electricity and water, amongst others. We're doing the small business RAB, and you can actually see that the extent to which, people just do not have access to these kinds of resources, and that limits their ability to grow. So that's forthcoming, though. That's not on the website yet.
Thanks, Neva, and to the rest of the panel. Are there any questions before I go back to the ones that have been posted? Any hands? I'm not seeing any hands. To Nokwanda, there is a question from Isaac.
Sorry, I had my hand up.
Oh, sorry, I missed that hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, I've got a million questions, but I'll only ask two. You recommend the subsidies on fossil fuel be phased out in South Africa. I'd just like to get a better understanding of that and how that would impact. And then, I fully support, I think Neva's thinking is, we must really start to think differently about our problems. The one thing that's clear in the world is change. Everything's changing faster and faster every day. To address our challenges, you have to add value in the economy, and you must create the opportunities for ordinary people to tap into those opportunities. Now, this renewable industry is a very good example where we try to create new industries, but we try and build it up from the supply side. And the example of solar panels, for example, the local value add is 10%. The cost to import all the components and assemble it locally is more than 10%. So from an economic analysis point of view, every panel you make, you add less value to the economy. So we must identify those areas where a lot of value can be added. And my suggestion is the first focus should be on developing an industrial value chain, because the small and medium businesses opportunities are not really in manufacturing, but they're in the rest of the value chain and the growth that results, the multiplier effect. That's where the opportunities are. And once you've got a established value chain, you can then move backwards into manufacturing in the areas where you can add value locally, rather than to push from the supply side, what we've been doing all along in South Africa. And what you see in the world now is there's oversupply of everything. So it's very difficult to import replace. You will never ever be able to compete. So really a plea that we must look differently at things, but interested in the fossil fuel one.
Thanks, Arad. Is
Zuki,
there
another question?
Yes.
So my first question was just about if we do need to have inputs that aren't at export parity pricing, surely being limited in our ability to export raw materials, I get that it hurts the raw material exporters, but overall, does it not? Steel, iron, aluminium less so, and I don't know about fertilizers, but those are major industrial inputs. Is it not useful to have more of those domestically available if the export potential is being limited? Yeah.
Thanks. Is there another question, or should I go online?
You can go online. Thank you.
Okay, Nick, over to you. Okay, Nick.
Thank you
please
very
go.
much. May I please just make a comment? It isn't really a query. The basic problem we have in South Africa is, and the last gentleman mentioned or touched on it, we nag and worry about supply chains and the government intention of directing business into somewhat more profitable ways of existing. The basic problem we have in South Africa is that the amount of money that is extracted by the government makes it impossible for business to expand. We have a situation where the government takes such a large proportion of the wealth that is created in the country that business does not have the opportunity to expand, develop, and grow. And this is particularly evident in smaller businesses and in individual entrepreneurs' attempts at standing on their feet in the face of costs which are imposed by government. There's fuel levies, there's permits, there are electricity costs, there are import duties, there are a host of things that are imposed because of the need to accumulate money for the government purposes, of which 37% is spent on wages. So we need to withdraw the amount of money that government takes out of the economy and leave it in the hands of business for them to be able to grow the economy. And this will happen because, as we can see, the amount of business tax that is being garnered now is reducing steadily because business is not making money, so they are just keeping what they have and spending it. If they had more money, they would be expanding. But if they don't have it, they'll just survive. And this is the problem we have at the moment with businesses throughout the economy managing to survive. And it's not adequate, and it's not going to change until we do something very radical about the balance between government and business. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I'll just look at a few questions online. Let me see the ones that I have not tackled. There is one from Elise, I think to you, Mohammed, on the carbon tax. The view is that our carbon tax is quite low. Do you know if SA has plans to align with US or Canada or UK levels, for example? There is another one, Nokwanda, on I think it is on the extent to which localization has resulted in companies that have benefited exporting, if you know of any. And then there is another one around master plans. I think this one is for you, Lucas, but I will tackle it in my closing remarks as well. Are we at the point of throwing in the towel, or is still hope for master plans, as there is an opinion that they have been brilliant in theory, but they have failed in practice? We have dealt with this one. There was another one on I think on SADC, Nokwanda. Would it make sense to focus on local production, specifically for local consumption, to enable the other SADC members better access to our infrastructure for trade purposes? We already have an established and world-class logistic industry. Let us sell that to the SADC region as they begin to industrialize. I think it's from Tsireletso Mokone. There's one to Dr. Neva Makgetla, and it's a follow-up. If we are saying we need to focus away from tariff protection and instead on reducing electricity costs, etc., does that mean these should be subsidized similar to large producing economies like China? China has massive energy-intensive upstream industry. How are they able and we are not, despite our abundance of natural resources? Is there another one that I'm missing? Yeah, can you please tackle those because we're also running out of time.
Okay, so I am going to start. On the companies that have benefited from localization in terms of growing their exports, I don't have a company in mind, but I would say look at the DTIC incentives reports. They do put in information about companies that have benefited from, the different incentives that the DTIC provides. Yeah, so I don't have a company name at the top of my mind. And then on the question of SADC, so we do have a world-class logistics infrastructure, except right now we're rerouting our ores exports via the port of Maputo. So I think we need to have a conversation about how that world-class logistics infrastructure is looking. But yeah, I do think that, there are obviously opportunities within SADC. And again, I'm going to go back to the question of where do we cede power and where do we use that power within the continent to say, hey, this is actually what we can do. I don't think that countries within SADC are just going to say, okay, South Africa, manufacture everything and we're just going to use your logistics infrastructure. I think at some point we are going to give, a portion of the work to the other countries. And I think part of that requires a proper assessment of what capacity is there. We talk a lot about things we need to manufacture, about things we need to change, but what capacity is there? And for me, the sort of assessment of production capacity, but also what we import the most, is important because then it gives us a sort of framework of where we can go. And I'm going to go back to the solar panels because for me, it requires thinking differently about this as well. It's not just about how much value addition goes into that when the panels come into South Africa. We're not obviously going to get to a point where we're able to compete with a country such as China. But the point here for me is not so much that we're adding value to something that's already sort of manufactured and then exporting it elsewhere. We have demand in this country for solar panels, for example. Eskom needs to rejig its entire electricity infrastructure. We need those panels. So rather than focusing on how much value addition we can put into that and then exporting it, let's look at the needs that we have in the country. Let's look at the needs we have within SADC, for example. We're not going to get to a point where we can compete if we're not even doing the work of trying to meet our own demand. And so let's start with the demand that's here, even if it means 10% value addition. But the issue is there is demand here and there's a lot to be learned from that process such that we're then able to move higher up the value chain rather than saying, yeah, let's start with these small parts. Most of the time, the small parts, especially what goes into solar panels, some of those parts are technology, are capital intensive. So it's not necessarily going to create the jobs that we want. But if we can focus on just meet the demand that we have here rather than jumping straight into exports, I think then we can sort of try to create the kind of industry that we need to supply our own needs, but then also put us in a position where we can at least compete, not with China maybe, but we can compete with other countries that are trying to do the same things.
All right, thanks, Nokwanda. I'm worried we're running out of time. Quickly, Mohammed.
So I was asked to do two questions. Gerard asked about the fossil fuel subsidies and Elise about the carbon tax. So first on the fossil fuel subsidies, we actually include an estimate in the report, and I'm just going to bring it up quickly. It says we quote an article by Jadis and Schmidt, and the estimate is that fossil fuel subsidies in South Africa between 2018 and 2023 tripled from 39 billion rand to 118 billion rand. With the questions of fossil fuel subsidies, you have to ask what is the incentive that's being made in the context of where we intend to go as an economy with our decarbonization aims versus channeling a subsidy, so straight resources into fossil fuels, primarily which go into oil, gas, and exemptions for high emitters. So, in short, fossil fuel subsidies are problematic, and the fact that we're channeling more and more resources into them are problematic. One also needs to ask about the equality element and who benefits and how pro-poor they actually are. So the answer would be that we really need to take a long, hard look at the trajectory of fossil fuel subsidies, how they align with our decarbonization goals, and the opportunity cost of those resources in our fiscal system. Okay, the second question is around the carbon tax, and so I'd like to also refer colleagues to a very good research report that was written recently by the Reserve Bank, and in short, the highest emitters don't fully absorb the carbon tax. Number one. Number two, the effective carbon tax after all the exemptions turns out to be quite low. Based on the Reserve Bank's estimates, a carbon tax consistent with a country like South Africa is around $30 to $50 per ton. We're currently much lower than that, around just over $10 a ton. And why is this important? So one is that we're not getting the emitters to internalize the costs of emissions. Second, it has important implications in other types of trade policies where carbon tax is an important input into like border carbon tariffs, for example, and the extent to which we decarbonize in our economy. So in short, the carbon tax is criticized for being on the lower end. There are obviously economic consequences from raising the carbon tax. So it's a careful balancing act that needs to be looked at there.
Thanks, Mohammed, Neva, or Lucas.
Okay. Okay, so on the questions on master plan. So yeah, the impact has been moderate, but in the interest of time, you can have a look at the TIPS website for a review of the master plan process as well as 4 case studies.
Yeah, so yeah, just to say on steel, it doesn't work that way because if we don't export, they're quite likely to say they need a tariff to ensure they get the domestic market. That pushes up the price domestically, so you don't get the benefits. And if you don't put up the price, they say they'll close down, so you end up importing anyways. So what I would argue is if we can't find a way to make those upstream industries competitive with imports, it's coming back to that second question, that's a problem. And we need to really think through what would it mean to say, tariffs are fine in the short run to stabilize an industry, to make those investments. The one thing I think is I hadn't really thought about before is, in effect, in our industrial policies, we've tended to act like the only thing that leads to lower productivity is technology, and we've ignored the cost of inputs and infrastructure. And I think part of that's because those things tend to lie outside the scope of the DTIC. So it's easier to talk about how do we do training, how do we, finance new investments and so on, than to say, how do we engage with DMRE on dealing with rents? Because, boy, they don't want to talk about that. I've personally been in those discussions. I mean, they may have changed since, but when we, last I talked to them, they were not happy. Treasury doesn't love it either. And on infrastructure, as we all know, it's very hard for the DTIC to engage on infrastructure and get results because those infrastructure agencies have a lot of other demands on them. But I think that to me, what comes through is we need to stop acting like the only thing that raises productivity, that the competitiveness depends only on technology, but it also depends on the cost of inputs, always. And, you talk about China, the key subsidies in China are actually through infrastructure and education. And, that has the benefit of cutting costs. It's not just a burden on the state budget. No? And what we haven't said, we had this very slow response to these infrastructure challenges, and on education remains incredibly unequal. I mean, in 1994, the share of Africans with a university degree was 3%. It's now around 6%. Whites, it was 18%. Now it's 30%. That right there tells you we're not providing education adequately to our people, and we have all the recent constraints on immigration of skilled people that are designed to maintain high pay for people with degrees, but we have no restraints on emigration of skilled people, even if we subsidize their education. So there's been, by my estimates, around 20% of all people who got degrees have left the country in the last 30 years. And that raises cost of production and increases the skill shortage in the country. Meanwhile, we're not letting people come in, particularly from other African countries who have those skills. And so I think that a much more consistent approach to saying, how do we bring down cost of inputs would be very helpful. So I don't know if you want to talk about the technology story.
Cool. So, sorry, just to reignite the question. So I've opened in front of me from the analyst recent research. So they've compiled the fuel subsidies, how they're dispersed across different policy avenues. So in financial year 2022-2023, and I've got a from 2018 to 2023, but let's just look at that year, 2022-2023. The total fossil fuel subsidies were 118 million US dollars. Sorry, 118. 118. 47 billion was just paid to multiple
We are
partners
struggling
for
to hear
exemptions
you,
from
Mohammed.
tax.
Your audio is intermittent to us online.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why. Anyway, the point being is that a significant proportion of the fossil fuel subsidies are going to exemptions from the carbon tax, but there are a whole host of other avenues that the fossil fuel subsidies are go towards, another example being VAT exemptions from the sale of gasoline, diesel, and paraffin. So there's quite a few categories that the subsidies get channeled to answer your question. You disagree, but
Thank you. I would like to, I think we have come now to the end of the policy dialogue. And I would want to thank the panel, the panelists, Neva, Nokwanda, Mohammed, Lucas, for those insightful papers and that have led to robust engagements in this dialogue. I want to thank you for all those that have attended physically and online, and I hope that you appreciate the challenge that or the difficulties that we face as policymakers, where industrial policy or economic development or economic policy is concerned. And as Neva said in her presentation, as policymakers, we are faced with hard choices. What choice do we make that doesn't disadvantage the other side? But we always have to take a balanced approach when it comes to policy making. The challenges that South Africa faces are quite unique because we have a history that we need to contend with. But we also need to also compete in this global arena. In doing that, we also need to focus on building capabilities that will help us do that or move us up the technological frontier. So a balanced approach is required. And we also need to make sure that we don't neglect the sectors that are the bedrock of the South African economy, because those are the sectors that have created, that are creating jobs, those are sectors that are helping the country to earn forex revenues. So colleagues, with those few words, I want to thank you all. Your inputs and insights are quite valuable to us. We look forward to further engagements on this topic of industrial policy, and my job is done for the day. We thank you all, and we can now adjourn the policy dialogue. Thank you.